When detectives pressed play on a wiretap in 2012, they heard something wild. A Baby Insane Crip bragging that his cop lady kept him fed with inside police secrets. At first, nobody wanted to believe that talk, because rumors like that fly all the time. But this wasn't random hood gossip. This was coming straight from Prentice P. Nice Jones. And the more they listened, the more one name floated into the light. Detective Yvonne Robinson, a 13-year veteran, wearing a badge in Long Beach. How does a decorated cop end up tangled with a gang like that? Long Beach sits right on the southern edge of Los Angeles County, a city split between palm trees, port money, and neighborhoods where the streets held more power than the city council. By the mid-'80s, the murder rate was jumping heavy, and the city was carving up into zones where sets ruled blocks like private kingdoms. The Crips had already stamped Long Beach by that time, building deep roots on the east side. The most notorious crew to come out of that soil was the Insane Crip gang, known around the city as ICG. They built their name on 21st Street, rolling deep and pulling younger cliques under their wing, making them one of the dominant sets in the area. Every generation brought a new clique, and by the early 1990s, a new wave of young heads broke off and called themselves the Baby Insane Crips. That baby tag didn't mean soft, it meant they were the new blood pushing the legacy forward. They held down 23rd Street, and the streets knew them as Bick. Unlike most Crip crews that carried blue, the Baby Insanes flipped the script. They rocked Cleveland Indians gear with that bold red C on the hats. Outsiders thought the red made them look like Bloods, but for Bick it was coded language. The C stood for Crip or Crazy, and the red threw rivals off, especially those expecting blue rags on every corner. BIC kept a reputation for chaos. They went to war with their own sometimes, clashing with other Crip sets like the West Coast Crips. Their beef with Barrio Longo 13, the city's biggest Latino gang, turned whole neighborhoods into war zones. By the 2000s, shootings between Bick and Barrio Longo had become a deadly back and forth that scarred families across Long Beach. The Baby Insanes were known for more than just banging. They carried themselves like a secret society, moving tight and keeping outsiders guessing. Cats in the hood said they always had inside connects, feeding them moves before the cops even showed up. Whether it was truth or just talk, the idea made them look untouchable. Law enforcement watched them heavy, because their name was always popping up in violent cases. In November 2009, 19-year-old Frank Castro Jr. got murdered, and whispers pointed straight at BIC members. That case put the crew under a magnifying glass, because the Castro murder wasn't a random beef. It tied to a larger pattern of retaliation shootings. By June 2012, after years of investigation, Long Beach police ran major raids on BIC. 16 members were scooped up in a single sweep. Among them were hitters tied to the Castro case, and names like Sabril Brill Ackland and Donovan Little Dog P. Halcomb surfaced as lieutenants inside the crew. For police, that sweep looked like a victory, but for BIC, it just added fuel to the paranoia. The streets around Long Beach were shifting fast during those years. Black sets were already pressed by racial beefs with Latino gangs, and now Asian crews like the Asian Boys and Tiny Rascals were growing. Tensions stacked on every corner, and police pressure made crews lean even harder on loyalty and secrecy. Inside that world, information was worth more than money. If a set could find someone with access to police moves, that person became gold. It didn't matter if it was a jail clerk, a dispatcher, or even a sworn cop. For gangs like BIC, just hearing about a pending raid or knowing which suspects were hot could change the outcome of a war. That is why the bragging on those 2012 wiretaps shook the whole Long Beach Police Department. Because when a gang already known for secrecy claimed they had a cop in their pocket, it sounded like the worst nightmare for any department. And as those wiretaps kept rolling, the whispers turned into a trail pointing back at one detective who had built her whole career on knowing the streets better than anybody. Yvonne Robinson grew up right in Long Beach, raised in the same neighborhoods that carried both pride and struggle. She walked the halls of Long Beach Polytechnic High School, the same school known for producing athletes, entertainers, and community leaders. Poly High had that mix of opportunity and danger, where graduation gowns shared space with street funerals. By the time she finished high school, the city was already knee-deep in gang politics. The mid-'80s had flooded Long Beach with the crack trade, and the streets were shifting heavy. Yvonne came of age during that storm, and she knew the codes spoken in neighborhoods where the Crips and Bloods left their mark. Around 2000, Robinson made a decision that would shape her whole adult life. She joined the Long Beach Police Department, choosing the badge over the block. She stepped into a department that was still learning how to work with communities that didn't always trust the cops. At first, she did the grind most rookies faced, walking beats, learning the system, and proving her worth. With time, she moved into the Youth Services Division, handling juvenile investigations and working with troubled kids. That move gave her a reputation for connecting with young people who others called lost causes. Her community ties made her valuable inside the department because she understood the streets in ways many officers didn't. She could talk to young Crip affiliates without them freezing up, and she knew which neighborhood businesses mattered. Supervisors leaned on her for insight when cases touched gang culture because she grew up in the same city. Robinson didn't just sit in the office writing reports. She showed up at community events. You could catch her at neighborhood gatherings, sports games, and local programs trying to show kids alternatives. She was part of the early LBPD gang outreach work, trying to slow down violence by building trust. In February 2012, the city even recognized her with a Community Service Award. That recognition was supposed to highlight her years of dedication, showing her as a positive face of policing. At that point, the department saw her as an example of how to build bridges with neighborhoods. Her career looked solid on paper, but the same closeness to the community that boosted her image later became a problem. People inside LBPD whispered about how she seemed too comfortable in certain spots. They watched her interact with locals who had reputations, and not everyone believed her style was clean. Still, for many years, she was known as a hardworking black woman who broke barriers inside a department with few like her. She often spoke on the fact that Long Beach didn't see enough black women wearing the badge. That identity gave her respect in parts of the community, especially among residents who felt overlooked. While she worked the job, she also held down her personal life. She was married to a man named Yvonne Robinson, another Long Beach native with deep neighborhood ties. They had at least one daughter together, raising her in the same city where both parents were rooted. That family connection pulled her even deeper into the city's social web, because Long Beach was a small town once you stepped into the circles of families, schools, and hoods. Even off duty, she was surrounded by faces and places tied to the streets. Her husband, Dion, had a history that prosecutors later pointed to during her trial. They claimed Dion had past gang affiliations, and in 2011, he even attended a funeral in gang colors. There were allegations that he drove Yvonne's city-issued vehicle to that funeral, which raised eyebrows later. In 2017, years after her arrest, Dion was murdered in a gang-related shooting. That tragedy showed how tightly her personal world and the gang world could collide without warning. Even though the court kept those details out of her case, it revealed how deep those neighborhood ties ran. Robinson's daughter also showed up in the trial records through a tattoo story that became important later. That family detail tied her even closer to Prentice P. Nice Jones. But at this point in her career, it was just another example of how community and personal life mixed. Inside the department, she had both supporters and skeptics. Some supervisors praised her as a bridge who gave cops eyes and ears in places they couldn't normally reach. Others said she blurred the lines too much, hanging around people who were under investigation. That tension between trust and suspicion shadowed her whole run with the badge. By 2012, she had over a decade of service behind her name, with a salary over 6 figures and a pension waiting down the road. For many in Long Beach, Robinson represented a success story, someone who came from the city and worked for the city. But the same streets she walked as a cop were the same ones that raised her, and those connections never really left. Every move she made, every handshake at a block party, every conversation at a neighborhood shop carried weight. Some saw it as dedication, while others saw it as danger. That complicated balance set the stage for everything that came after, because once the Baby Insane Crip started bragging about having an inside cop, the city was ready to listen. And Yvonne Robinson's past, her community ties, and her reputation made her a prime suspect when the investigation began to heat up. Back in 2009, Long Beach Polytechnic High School hosted a basketball game that turned into something bigger. Detective Yvonne Robinson arranged for a local rap group to perform during the event. The group was called the P.E. Boys, led by a young rapper named Prentice P. Nice Jones. On the surface, this looked like another community event, giving young artists a platform in front of classmates. Robinson said she wanted to bring positivity into the school and keep kids engaged. At the time, nobody inside LBPD questioned her decision, since it seemed like community outreach. Later, that booking became one of the first official links between Robinson and the Baby Insane Crips. Prosecutors pointed out that Jones wasn't just a rapper, he was a documented BIC member. His arrest records carried that stamp, and his tattoos spelled out the same affiliation. Jones had gang ink visible on his body, the type of markings detectives noticed quickly. The argument from the prosecution was simple. Robinson had built her reputation as a gang expert. If anyone inside the department should have recognized the signs, they said it was her. Robinson's defense pushed back hard, saying she didn't know Jones's history when she booked him. She explained that she never Googled him or checked his arrest background before the school show. She claimed that in 2009, she wasn't tasked with vetting performers for gang affiliations. That defense was one of her key points when her case finally went to trial years later. Still, prosecutors kept coming back to that poly-high booking as the moment she crossed paths with Jones. They framed it as the start of a relationship that later compromised her career. Inside the Long Beach Police Department, whispers were already floating before any wiretap recordings ever surfaced. Officers said rumors circled about Robinson having an unusually close connection with a gang member. Some claimed they heard she might even be sleeping with one, although no proof existed then. Those whispers stayed around like smoke, without enough to spark an official fire inside the department. Detective Satwan Johnson later admitted he had heard similar talk during those years, but ignored it. He said he brushed it off because it wasn't part of any investigation he worked. The rumors never went on record during that time, but they built a shadow around Robinson's reputation. She was respected for her community ties, but that same respect also made people suspicious. Some colleagues felt she blurred professional lines with people who had known gang ties. At trial years later, prosecutors leaned on those whispers to support their case against her. They argued the gossip was proof that her closeness to the streets raised red flags earlier. Even though no one reported her, the talk inside LBPD made it easier to believe accusations later. Beyond Jones, Robinson's personal life brought more fuel for suspicion. Her husband, Yvonne Robinson, had his own past tied to gang culture in Long Beach. Prosecutors claimed Dion showed up at a 2011 gang funeral wearing gang colors. They even alleged that Dion drove Yvonne's city-issued police vehicle to that funeral service. That detail stuck out because it blurred the line between professional and personal choices in a public way. While the judge kept that information limited during the trial, the story painted a certain picture. Years later, Dion's life ended violently when he was murdered in a gang-related shooting. That tragedy happened in 2017, long after Yvonne was already charged in fighting her case. Even though it wasn't directly tied to her trial, the detail reminded people of her world. The prosecution used Dion's background to suggest Robinson should have known she was too close to dangerous circles. The defense countered that her husband's history had nothing to do with her professional decisions. But once those details entered the conversation, the suspicion against her looked heavier. The poly-high booking of P. Nice Jones never looked like much in 2009. To her supporters, it was an officer trying to put a spotlight on young talent. To prosecutors years later, it became a sign that Robinson ignored obvious gang affiliations. That one event connected Robinson to Jones, who later emerged as the BIC member, bragging about an inside cop. It showed how a seemingly small decision from years earlier became part of a bigger picture. Once investigators heard Jones bragging on the wiretaps, that school performance took on new meaning. From there, every personal detail, every rumor, every family connection added layers to the story. Detectives and prosecutors pieced together a timeline where Robinson's life touched the gang world more than once. To them, she wasn't just unlucky, she was compromised by choice. Whether Robinson truly knew Jones was big in 2009 remained one of the biggest questions in her case. That answer shaped how people judged her, both inside the courtroom and out in the city she once served. By the summer of 2012, the streets of Long Beach were buzzing with police pressure. The Baby Insane Crips, one of the most notorious sets in the city, found themselves under heavy fire. Law enforcement had been stacking cases against them for years, waiting for the right moment. In June 2012, Long Beach police and federal agents moved in with a major sweep. 16 members and associates of the Baby Insane Crips were taken into custody that week. The operation was the result of years of surveillance, wiretaps, and carefully built evidence. Detectives targeted BIC because the gang had been connected to a long list of shootings. Their reputation for reckless violence made them one of the city's top priorities for suppression. The sweep wasn't just about numbers, it was about crippling their influence across neighborhoods. At the heart of the investigation stood a murder case that haunted the community for years. Back in 2009, a man named Frank Castro Jr. had been killed in Long Beach. Castro was gunned down outside a store in a shooting that shook his family. Detectives believed members of the Baby Insane Crips carried out the Castro murder. That case became central to the eventual 2012 crackdown because it tied directly to BIC shooters. Prosecutors saw the murder as proof of the gang's growing recklessness in the late 2000s. The Castro killing didn't fade quietly. It fueled a momentum for investigators who wanted to dismantle BIC. By tying the gang to a single, devastating crime, authorities built a foundation for a broader case. They knew if they cracked one murder, other dominoes could start falling. Over time, surveillance on BIC grew stronger and more advanced. Wiretaps, undercover informants, and constant monitoring turned into everyday tools for the task force. Detectives listened closely, waiting for any slip-up that could connect members to murders or conspiracies. The more the police closed in, the more desperate BIC members became on the streets. That desperation showed in their conversations, movements, and even the way they spoke to girlfriends. Pressure built inside the gang, making them paranoid about snitches and potential leaks. For Bick, survival meant finding someone who could keep them ahead of law enforcement. When cops are watching you daily, every piece of intel becomes life or death. Gang members wanted inside knowledge, any scrap of information that could help dodge raids or warrants. The sweep of June 2012 proved that detectives had cracked deeper than the gang realized. Wiretaps revealed connections, movements, and coded language that eventually linked them to multiple crimes. 16 arrests hit the gang hard, forcing their leadership to scramble for ways to regroup. This wasn't just a Long Beach issue, it was part of a larger California gang crackdown. Law enforcement agencies statewide had been investing resources in crushing sets tied to violent murders. Bick was high on that list because of their history of open shootouts. For the detectives, keeping eyes on BIC became almost an obsession. They used every tactic possible to stay one step ahead of the crew. Wiretaps weren't just about listening. They were about mapping out a gang's entire ecosystem. In those monitored calls, members started showing how badly they needed protection from the heat. They spoke about police movements, asking questions about how investigations seemed to close in so fast. Some conversations even hinted at the idea of having someone feeding them information. That paranoia pushed investigators to dig deeper, curious about how Bick always seemed prepared for raids. Detectives began to wonder if the gang had an inside line to the department. The thought of a cop tipping them off sounded wild, but the evidence started mounting. The Castro murder kept driving the investigation, but new threads started forming through those wiretaps. Prosecutors saw a chance not only to charge shooters, but also to expose a bigger conspiracy. The possibility of corruption inside LBPD added another layer of intrigue to the case. By the time 2012 ended, the Baby Insane Crips were bleeding from legal hits. Their numbers on the street thinned, their confidence cracked, and their paranoia reached new levels. Each new arrest fed the idea that someone was tipping cops on their activities. That kind of suspicion is poison in a gang already under fire. Every move got second-guessed. Every conversation replayed in the heads of paranoid members. Some whispered that a cop might be helping them, while others thought someone was selling them out. The wiretap that changed everything came during this stretch of heightened tension. Detectives listening to conversation heard something they never expected from a gang member. A line that suggested the impossible. A police officer was leaking information straight to the Baby Insane Crips. That moment shifted the investigation forever and set Yvonne Robinson's name into the center of the storm. The sweep had already left the Baby Insane Crips shaking, but the paranoia only grew stronger. Early in 2012, detectives on the Long Beach Police Department began catching something unusual on their wiretaps. Members of the Baby Insane Crips started whispering about having an inside cop. That phrase alone was enough to make investigators sit upright. An inside cop meant someone on the force was possibly leaking information. At first, some officers thought it was gang members bragging, just trying to boost their reputations. But as the calls continued, the pattern looked less like street talk and more like coded truth. One name kept surfacing in conversations, a familiar figure around Poly High and the community. Gregory P. Nice Jones, a known member of the Baby Insane Crips, started bragging. He told others in conversations that he had an inside connect who was keeping him updated. P. Nice Jones was no stranger to police eyes. He had tattoos tied directly to Bick, and he carried an arrest record as thick as a phone book. On the streets, his word carried weight, and his confidence on the wiretaps didn't sound like empty flexing. Detectives soon realized the brag wasn't just empty talk. Something about the detail in his claims pointed to specific knowledge. He seemed to know things only the police should have known about ongoing cases. That realization triggered alarms inside the department because it meant someone was feeding him real information. Investigators went back over past calls and started piecing together timelines. They matched what Jones had been saying with what the department had been releasing publicly. The more they cross-referenced, the scarier it looked. Jones was ahead of certain moves, almost like he was reading directly from police notes. The case that put everything under a microscope was the murder of Frank Castro Jr. Detectives had spent years building charges against BIC members tied to that killing. In March 2012, the department dropped a press release with composite sketches of suspected shooters. That press release came out on March 26, 2012, and within minutes, something strange happened. Records later showed that Detective Yvonne Robinson placed a 10-minute phone call to Gregory P. Nice Jones. That timing was impossible to ignore. Investigators couldn't believe what they were seeing because it was too perfect to be coincidence. Within 10 minutes of sketches hitting the public, Robinson was on the line with the Jones. What followed on the wiretap left detectives in shock. BIC members started repeating lines that made investigators' stomachs drop. They said things like, "They already know the shooters," and moved like they had been tipped off. The exact phrasing sent chills because the words matched the details released by the police. Only someone with a direct line to police chatter could pass information that quickly. Jones wasn't guessing. He was speaking with certainty about things he shouldn't have known. The conversation spread fast across different wiretap recordings. Members spoke like the heat was right on their necks, almost panicked, but reassured by inside whispers. The sudden knowledge about the Castro case gave the impression that somebody was handing them blueprints. Within the department, alarm bells rang louder than ever. Detectives who had worked years against Big couldn't believe there might be a leak. Nobody wanted to think about a cop turning into a gang asset, but the evidence stacked up. The suspicion slowly started turning inward, with a mole hunt quietly beginning inside the department. It wasn't an official press statement, it wasn't loud, but behind the scenes it became serious. Internal investigators began looking at phone logs, relationships, and suspicious contact points between officers and gang members. Yvonne Robinson's name started hovering in conversations within the department. She had built a reputation as a community-friendly officer who spent time with youth. But those same roots in Long Beach meant she had proximity to gang-affiliated individuals. People started whispering about whether she crossed the line. At first, some officers didn't believe Robinson could really be involved. She had earned commendations, awards, and even community service recognition back in 2012. Her career path looked like someone dedicated to bridging the gap between cops and the community. But the wiretap evidence was stubborn. P. Nice Jones's bragging wasn't vague. It had timing and detail that matched her calls. The fact she contacted him within 10 minutes of the Castro Sketches release spoke volumes. Inside the department, the feeling grew heavier with each passing day. Detectives monitoring calls realized they weren't chasing rumors anymore. They were chasing a colleague. That thought weighed on morale because nobody signs up expecting betrayal from their own squad. The more Jones spoke on the wire, the bolder he sounded. He acted like he was untouchable because someone inside was shielding him. That bravado made investigators even more determined to follow the trail back to the source. By April 2012, the internal mole hunt was in motion. Phone records, surveillance, and deeper audits of officer activity became standard. Robinson's call stood out as a glowing red flag, impossible to downplay once evidence aligned. The insider leak wasn't just a theory anymore, it was a growing case. Every new tape added to the story, making investigators believe they had identified their mole. The thought of someone wearing a badge while protecting Bick created pure outrage within the department. Some detectives later said it was one of the most disheartening discoveries of their careers. Years of building community trust crumbled when whispers of corruption spread through Long Beach. The fact it might be a decorated officer only deepened the wound. Still, the investigation couldn't be rushed. Detectives had to stack evidence piece by piece, making sure nothing slipped through the court cracks. A case built on leaks had to be airtight because defense attorneys would jump at loopholes. The Castro case stayed central because it tied everything together. A murder unsolved for years, a gang member bragging, and a cop's phone call. That chain of evidence built the core of the upcoming storm. From the wiretaps, it became clear that Bick knew more than they ever should have. They were acting on intel straight from the heart of the department. That level of betrayal meant investigators couldn't trust anyone until they finished their mole hunt. By mid-2012, the writing was on the wall for Robinson, even if it wasn't official yet. Her credibility as a community bridge now looked like a cover for something darker. Every friendly handshake, every school event, suddenly looked suspicious through the new lens. The Baby Insane Crips had been under fire for years, but now the fire spread inward. Law enforcement wasn't just chasing gangsters, they were chasing corruption on their own team. The mole hunt officially began, and every clue pointed straight toward Detective Yvonne Robinson. By mid-2012, investigators knew suspicion wasn't enough. They needed undeniable proof before moving on a fellow officer. Detectives designed a sting, a quiet test that would expose whether Robinson was truly the inside cop. The setup came through the James Welch assault report. Welch was another Baby Insane Crip member who had caught police attention. He had been involved in an ugly street beatdown, the kind of assault that left bruises, stitches, and police paperwork stacked. Investigators crafted a plan that looked ordinary on the surface, but was carefully staged behind the scenes. They prepared two versions of the official report, one real, one sanitized. The real report carried every gritty detail of the assault, but the sanitized version stripped out identifying elements. Detectives deliberately funneled the sanitized version into Robinson's hands. It was subtle, designed so she wouldn't suspect she was under a microscope. Her access looked routine, part of her departmental responsibilities. Nothing about the delivery scream trap. The real test came on the wire. Not long after Robinson received the sanitized report, Gregory P. Nice Jones started talking. Wiretap recordings captured him describing details from the assault report that hadn't been released to the public. The phrases he used matched the sanitized version exactly, not the version filed for evidence. That match told detectives everything. The leak wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't rumor or gossip. It was precise information passed directly from Robinson. On the recording, Jones bragged openly, "That's my inside connect." Those words landed like a hammer strike inside the investigation room. It was the clearest confirmation yet that Robinson had crossed the line from officer to asset. Detectives replayed the recording, letting the weight of each word settle. Jones wasn't speaking vaguely or bragging about street rumors. He was parroting hidden details, words he could only have learned from one source. The sting worked exactly as planned. By designing the sanitized report with hidden markers, investigators created a blueprint. When Jones repeated those exact markers, the blueprint lit up like a neon sign pointing at Robinson. That moment marked the turning point. Years of whispers and suspicion suddenly hardened into something prosecutors could build a case around. No defense attorney could argue away the fact that Robinson's access matched Jones's words. But investigators didn't stop with the paperwork. They kept surveillance rolling, determined to track her movements outside the office. Soon after the sting, Robinson was spotted off-duty meeting with Gregory Jones. The meeting wasn't staged like some undercover rendezvous. It looked casual, like two people who had no reason to hide. Robinson later told investigators her presence was innocent, claiming she was only explaining the meaning behind his tattoos. That explanation sounded weak to prosecutors once the wiretap evidence sat beside it. Tattoos might need clarification for civilians, but Jones wasn't a confused outsider. He was a hardened BIC member with ink carrying clear gang significance. Prosecutors painted the meeting as another layer of the relationship. They argued Robinson wasn't clarifying tattoos, she was maintaining contact with her source. Combined with the wiretap evidence, the explanation looked like smoke trying to hide a fire. For investigators, the sting became the smoking gun. Years of whispers, rumors, and half-truths finally crystallized into solid evidence. They had an officer on tape leaking hidden details to a gang member under surveillance. The sting also proved method, not just association. Before, skeptics argued Robinson might have just known gang members socially through her family ties. The sting showed she was actively transferring law enforcement information into gang channels. It changed the case from circumstantial suspicion to prosecutable evidence. Detectives no longer had to rely on gossip or timing coincidences. They had their mole caught red-handed, passing secret details that landed word for word on gang wiretaps. Inside the department, the mood was heavy. Officers who once defended Robinson against whispers now couldn't ignore the evidence. The sting stripped away doubt, replacing it with anger and betrayal. On the streets, BIC members acted more emboldened, speaking freely about their inside advantage. Every word only tightened the noose around Robinson, proving her usefulness to them came directly from badge access. Investigators documented each step with painstaking care, knowing the case had to be airtight in court. They logged the sanitized report's creation, its distribution to Robinson, and the subsequent appearance of those details on wiretap calls. The timeline formed a chain of custody that couldn't be broken. Robinson received sanitized information. Robinson contacted Jones. Jones repeated those same details while bragging about his inside connect. The phrase inside connect became the prosecution's centerpiece. It was raw street language, but carried weight like sworn testimony. For a jury, those words explained the case more clearly than any technical evidence ever could. Robinson's off-duty meeting with Jones only added a personal angle to the case. Prosecutors framed it as proof that her connection wasn't professional oversight, it was personal loyalty. The tattoos excuse looked flimsy next to the wiretap brag. For law enforcement, the sting was bittersweet. They had cracked their mole case, but the cost was discovering one of their own had betrayed them. Community trust, already fragile in Long Beach, suffered another blow when news later leaked. Still, the sting operation was necessary. Without it, Robinson might have continued passing intelligence unchecked, giving BIC a shield against prosecutions. The stakes were too high, and the Castro murder case demanded clean resolution. By late 2012, investigators knew they had enough to move beyond suspicion. The sting had transformed the narrative. Robinson was no longer a decorated community officer under unfair whispers. She was the confirmed inside cop. Every recorded call, every leaked detail, and every casual meeting now stacked against her. The sting didn't just catch Robinson, it reshaped the case into one prosecutors could carry confidently into court. The integrity test with James Welch's assault report had delivered the proof they needed. And once that smoking gun appeared, there was no turning back for Detective Yvonne Robinson. By the summer of 2012, the sting operation had already sealed Robinson's fate. Behind closed doors, command staff moved carefully, knowing the next steps would define not just one career, but the department's credibility. In July 2012, Robinson was officially placed on administrative leave. To the public, the announcement sounded procedural, but within the department, the weight was heavier. Years of suspicion had hardened into evidence, and now the badge she once carried as a symbol of community pride was frozen in limbo. Investigators spent those weeks building the file that would eventually land on prosecutors' desks. They documented 21 separate contacts between Robinson and Gregory P. Nice Jones that raised alarms. These weren't casual run-ins or accidental phone calls. The records showed a pattern of deliberate connection, a pipeline of information flowing from the department into the streets. Some contacts were phone calls made on sensitive days, when surveillance was active or arrests were unfolding. Other contacts coincided with moments when gang units were preparing tactical moves against BIC members. To investigators, the timing was too precise to ignore. Robinson wasn't just talking, she was tipping off. One report highlighted a call where Robinson reached out almost immediately after detectives picked up a BIC affiliate. On the wire, Jones spoke soon afterward, warning others about the arrest. The trail of cause and effect was clear enough to map on a whiteboard. Another record showed Robinson calling Jones within minutes of surveillance teams being deployed in known BIC areas. Shortly after, gang members adjusted their routes and movements, like players warned before the whistle blew. For prosecutors, those links built a narrative of intentional interference. By March 2013, the department had reached its breaking point. Robinson was formally terminated from the Long Beach Police Department. The firing stripped away the uniform, the paycheck, and the authority she had built since her days as a community officer. The decision didn't come lightly. Terminating a sworn officer always carried a risk of union appeals, lawsuits, or backlash. But in Robinson's case, the file was thick with recordings, phone logs, and surveillance notes. There was no room left for departmental leniency. Her dismissal was a quiet prelude to what would follow. For months, investigators coordinated with federal and state partners, building a criminal case that stretched beyond internal discipline. They wanted charges that could stand in court, not just in departmental hearings. By December 2013, the waiting ended. Robinson was arrested alongside Gregory Jones in a sweep that carried symbolism far beyond routine arrests. The booking photo of a former detective standing beside a known gang member spoke louder than any press release. The LBPD quickly held a press conference. Commanders stood at the podium, their voices measured but heavy. They called Robinson's actions a betrayal of public trust, words chosen to capture both the legal and emotional weight of the scandal. For the community, the fallout was immediate. Residents who once saw Robinson as a friendly officer at school events now read headlines framing her as a gang mole. The betrayal cut deeper because Robinson had worked in outreach, mentoring kids and building ties across Long Beach neighborhoods. Media outlets replayed the story with sharp headlines. Detective leaks to BIC, cop arrested with gang member. The narrative spread quickly, feeding both outrage and disappointment. For many, the case became a symbol of how fragile trust between police and community could be. Within the department, morale took a hit. Officers who had worked alongside Robinson felt embarrassed, some even angry. Training rooms filled with whispers about how long the department had ignored early warning signs. For gang prosecutors, however, the arrest carried more than scandal. It also carried a unique legal weight. Robinson wasn't just facing ordinary charges of obstruction or conspiracy. Prosecutors filed with gang enhancement clauses, a legal tool normally reserved for street affiliates, not sworn officers. The symbolism was powerful. Charging a police detective with a gang enhancement meant the court recognized her as an active participant in gang benefit, not just a bystander. It was a statement that her badge didn't shield her from the same laws used against the streets she once patrolled. The press covered that angle with intensity. Commentators pointed out the irony of a cop charged with the same legal weapon used to take down the Crips themselves. Some saw it as poetic justice, others as an embarrassing stain on the department's credibility. For Robinson, the weight was personal. Losing the badge had already crushed her career, but the criminal charges transformed her situation from professional ruin to personal jeopardy. Now she wasn't just unemployed, she was a defendant. Jones, for his part, leaned on the same street bravado he had displayed on the wire, but prosecutors had a different narrative ready. They argued the two weren't just romantically tied, they were co-conspirators, each playing a role in shielding BIC from justice. The community of Long Beach watched closely. Every update on Robinson's case drew public interest, not only because of the salacious details, but because it symbolized broader issues of corruption, loyalty, and the blurred line between law enforcement and the streets. Her fall became a cautionary tale, the kind of story whispered in both squad rooms and gang corners. For cops, it was a warning about crossing personal boundaries. For gang members, it was proof that even the badge could be bent when loyalty or romance came into play. By the time court proceedings began, the collapse of Robinson's career was already complete. She had gone from respected officer to disgraced ex-cop in less than 2 years. The firing, The arrest and the gang enhancement charges locked her reputation into a single narrative: the cop who chose the gang. The case also reshaped how LBPD approached internal oversight. More eyes turned toward monitoring officer associations, social circles, and off-duty behavior. Robinson's scandal became a textbook example of how small personal ties could snowball into department-wide damage. Still, no policy change could erase the symbolic image of Robinson standing beside Jones in handcuffs. That photo lived longer than her years of service, becoming the defining image of her legacy. And as the department closed ranks around its press conferences and internal reforms, one truth remained. Detective Yvonne Robinson's career didn't just collapse, it imploded under the weight of betrayal, exposure, and the rare spectacle of a cop facing gang enhancement charges. When Robinson was booked in December 2013, her stance was immediate and defiant. She entered her first hearings with a not guilty plea, rejecting the notion that she had betrayed her oath. Lawyers representing her framed the case as circumstantial, built on timing, rumors, and the words of gang members eager to reduce their own burdens. From the beginning, the prosecution offered deals. They presented plea agreements that would have reduced her exposure to lengthy sentences, possibly sparing her prison time in exchange for a guilty admission. But Robinson refused. Her decision was firm. Accepting a plea would mean surrendering to a narrative that painted her as a gang mole, a label she insisted was false. Her co-defendant, Gregory P. Nice Jones, made a different calculation. By 2017, after years of delays and mounting pressure, Jones accepted a plea deal. He received probation and community service rather than serious time behind bars. For prosecutors, Jones's plea at least brought some closure, confirming his role in spreading insider information. For Robinson, it deepened the divide. The man at the center of her downfall walked free while she prepared to keep fighting. Court records show that Robinson was offered similar paths, but she repeatedly rejected them. Friends and former colleagues speculated on her reasons. Some believed she was stubborn, unwilling to concede guilt for actions she saw as misrepresented. Others thought she still carried hope that a jury might see enough holes in the case to acquit. Whatever her reasoning, her refusal set the stage for a long and exhausting journey. The legal process stretched across years, clogged by motions, continuances, and discovery battles. Defense attorneys challenged wiretap interpretations, questioned whether her calls to Jones were truly incriminating, and argued that the prosecution leaned too heavily on inference. Prosecutors countered with phone records, transcripts, and testimony that framed her behavior as deliberate leaks. Each side dug in, and the calendar filled with postponements. The delays were more than procedural. They slowly consumed Robinson's personal life. In 2017, tragedy struck when her son Dion was killed in a gang-related shooting. He had long been connected to the streets, his name surfacing in incidents years before, and his death added a cruel layer of weight to Robinson's story. Supporters said the tragedy hardened her resolve to fight, while critics noted it deepened suspicions about the world she remained tied to. By then, Robinson had already been out of the department for years, her badge gone, and her name synonymous with betrayal in Long Beach headlines. Still, she lived with the uncertainty of a looming trial. The case became a slow-motion ordeal, grinding through California's crowded court system. The COVID-19 pandemic added another twist. In 2020, trials across Los Angeles County and beyond were suspended or postponed, backlogs growing by the month. Robinson's case, already years delayed, was pushed further into the future. For her, it meant more waiting, more living under indictment without resolution. Meanwhile, the community around Long Beach debated her legacy. Some residents argued she had been made into a scapegoat, targeted because the department needed someone to blame for leaks during a high-pressure gang war. They pointed to inconsistencies, questioned whether the insider truly had to be Robinson, and noted that Jones had walked with probation. Others saw her as the clear culprit, the detective who crossed lines until she became part of the machinery she once policed. Radio shows, blogs, and street conversations kept the story alive. Every mention of the Baby Insane Crips drew Robinson's name back into the discussion. The image of her standing in handcuffs alongside Jones remained a symbol, interpreted differently depending on perspective. To some, it was evidence of corruption exposed. To others, it was proof of an overreaching system willing to sacrifice one of its own. As the years stretched on, Robinson's legal bills mounted, and her personal world narrowed. The once active detective who had patrolled neighborhoods and attended school functions now lived in the shadow of her trial. Lawyers came and went, motions stacked on motions, but the core question remained. Had she knowingly fed information to a gang member, or had her personal life simply collided with her professional obligations in a way that looked incriminating? By 2021, nearly 8 years after her arrest, the case finally approached trial. The courtroom doors were ready to open, and Robinson's story, dragged through every possible delay, was about to be judged. The long legal battle had taken away her career, her reputation, and her family's stability. What remained was the final verdict: delayed but unavoidable, a reckoning that had been promised since the first wiretap raised alarm bells in 2012. When the case finally reached trial in July 2021, it carried nearly a decade of buildup. Journalists filled the gallery, former colleagues from Long Beach Police Department watched the proceedings, and community members came hoping to see answers after years of speculation. The stakes were not just about one detective, but about the credibility of the entire department. From the first moments, the prosecution's framing was clear. Prosecutors painted Robinson as a trusted officer who betrayed her badge for personal reasons. They used simple language, telling jurors that the case was not rocket science. To them, it was a straightforward pattern: a detective with access to sensitive files, phone records tying her to a gang member, and wiretaps where gang affiliates bragged about having a police insider. Their narrative focused on betrayal and conspiracy, reminding the jury that the badge carried obligations she had ignored. The defense countered with a different framing. They said Robinson was a community-focused officer, misunderstood by her own department. They argued that her relationships with residents, even those tied to gangs, were part of community policing. According to them, she had not leaked secrets, but had become the victim of gossip, whispers, and an overzealous investigation. They portrayed her as someone who blurred boundaries to help, not harm. The wiretap evidence became the centerpiece. Prosecutors played recordings of Baby Insane Crip's members discussing their cop lady. Jurors heard P. Nice Jones bragging about his inside connect. They heard gang affiliates repeat details that matched information only law enforcement should have known. Each playback brought tension into the room, with prosecutors explaining context and defense attorneys challenging interpretations. The March 26, 2012 call received particular attention. That was the day Robinson phoned Jones within minutes of the department releasing composite sketches in the Castro murder investigation. Jurors heard the timeline reconstructed step by step: press release, Robinson's call, then wiretap chatter about law enforcement already knowing the shooters. Prosecutors called it no coincidence, presenting it as the clearest example of her funneling intelligence to a gang. The sting operation followed in the prosecution's sequence. Jurors heard how Robinson was deliberately given a sanitized report about the James Welch assault, a document containing details unknown to the public. Shortly after, those exact hidden details surfaced in a call from Jones. He repeated them almost word for word and added the phrase, "That's my inside connect." Prosecutors hammered that link as the smoking gun. The moment suspicion transformed into proof. Alongside the recordings, prosecutors displayed call logs. Charts showed 21 contacts between Robinson and Jones at suspicious times. Days when arrests happened, days when surveillance teams moved, and days when internal documents were circulated. To prosecutors, it was a pattern too sharp to dismiss. Then came Robinson's own testimony. She chose to take the stand, a move many defendants avoid. Wearing dark suits and speaking steadily, she denied every claim of intentional leaking. She told jurors she had been misunderstood, that her calls were rooted in personal ties and community obligations rather than criminal conspiracy. She emphasized that she never used her badge to tip anyone off, and that the prosecution twisted coincidences into conspiracies. When asked about her relationship with Jones, she leaned on the community policing defense. She said she had known him through neighborhood functions, talent shows, and personal circles. She described her outreach style as one that demanded trust, and trust meant contact. For her, this blurred line between work and personal life was not betrayal, it was engagement. The tattoo incident resurfaced. Prosecutors pointed to the 2009 Poly High Performance booking, where she encountered Jones and later met with him off-duty. Robinson repeated her earlier explanation. She was investigating his tattoo, not socializing. Her defense attorneys argued that prosecutors had inflated the narrative, twisting a detail-focused officer's actions into something illicit. The defense also targeted Jones's credibility. They suggested he inflated his importance within the gang, exaggerating his access to a police insider to boost his status. According to them, prosecutors relied on the self-promotion of a man who benefited by making himself look powerful. They told jurors that the gang world thrived on bravado, and that bragging did not equal proof. Courtroom dynamics became critical. Jurors leaned forward during wiretap playback, scribbling notes. Some raised eyebrows during Robinson's denials, while others appeared sympathetic when she spoke of her son's death and her community ties. Prosecutors projected confidence, keeping arguments tight and repeating the phrase betrayal of trust. Defense attorneys worked on creating doubt, stressing the fragility of hearsay and the risk of convicting based on gossip. Credibility was the battlefield. Prosecutors reminded jurors that Robinson had been trained to safeguard intelligence, that every officer knew the gravity of leaking information. They framed her denials as implausible when stacked against wiretap evidence. Defense attorneys urged jurors to consider her career before the allegations. her years of service, and the absence of direct proof showing her intentionally handing documents to Jones. Witnesses added weight on both sides. Fellow officers testified about suspicions within the department, whisper campaigns, and her reputation for being too close to certain community members. Defense cross-examination highlighted the lack of written reprimands before the case, suggesting that whispers had been magnified once a mole hunt began. Each day of testimony drew the community closer to closure. The trial became not only about Robinson, but about how a city wanted to define loyalty, betrayal, and trust between police and residents. Prosecutors wanted jurors to see her as a cautionary tale. The defense wanted them to see her as a casualty of misinterpretation. As closing arguments approached, the tension built. Prosecutors ended where they began, reminding jurors that the case was not rocket science. They urged them to follow the evidence, the calls, the wiretaps, the patterns. They said Robinson's actions endangered investigations and undermined justice for murder victims like Frank Castro Jr. Defense lawyers closed with pleas for nuance, arguing that community policing is messy, that personal ties do not equal conspiracy, and that jurors must not convict based on assumptions amplified by gossip. The jury left the courtroom to deliberate with the stacks of transcripts, recordings, and notes. For Robinson, it was the culmination of 9 years of waiting. For the city, it was the final test of whether betrayal had indeed taken place or whether suspicion had outweighed proof. The trial had already carried high stakes, but the late testimony of Detective Satwan Johnson shifted the entire courtroom atmosphere. It came near the end of proceedings, when both sides thought they understood the boundaries of evidence. Johnson's words introduced an unexpected element that prosecutors seized and defense attorneys immediately tried to crush. Johnson testified that years earlier, in 2008, Robinson had approached him with a casual but telling remark. According to him, she had shown him a photograph of Marlon P. Nice Jones and told him she was messing around with him. Johnson described the interaction as offhand, the type of personal admission that stuck with him because of the unusual overlap between an officer and a gang affiliate. His statement landed with force because it contradicted Robinson's own sworn testimony about when and how she met Jones. Throughout her defense, Robinson insisted that her first meaningful encounter with Jones occurred later, tied to community events and outreach. She said her contact with him had roots in professional circles, framed through the lens of community policing. Johnson's recollection undermined that timeline completely. If she had been involved with Jones personally as early as 2008, then her later explanations about tattoo inquiries and neighborhood functions seemed less plausible. The defense erupted in outrage. Attorneys immediately argued that the testimony amounted to an ambush, delivered too late in the process for them to prepare. They filed a motion for mistrial, claiming the prosecution had withheld or buried information that should have been disclosed earlier. The defense characterized Johnson's remarks as hearsay, dressed up as credibility, a dangerous insertion of gossip into an already fragile case. The judge deliberated carefully on the objection. Defense lawyers pushed for exclusion, warning that admitting Johnson's words would irreparably taint the jury's view of Robinson's honesty. Prosecutors countered that credibility was the core of the case and that Johnson's testimony went directly to that issue. In the end, the judge sided with the prosecution, allowing the jury to hear it and to weigh its significance. The ruling marked a turning point. Until then, the defense strategy had leaned heavily on the idea that Robinson's ties to Jones were exaggerated by outsiders, that she had never crossed professional lines. Johnson's recollection shattered that narrative. Now jurors had heard a fellow detective say that Robinson herself admitted to being romantically linked to Jones well before the alleged leaks. The impact was immediate. Court observers noted jurors shifting in their seats, eyes narrowing, pens moving rapidly across notepads. The testimony fed directly into the prosecution's theme of betrayal. If Robinson had personal loyalty to Jones, then her willingness to risk her badge for him seemed more believable. The idea of an affair gave jurors a human motive, something simple and understandable beneath the complex web of calls and wiretaps. The defense continued to fight. They attacked Johnson's memory, questioning why he had waited so many years to share such a critical detail. They asked whether he might have misremembered or confused conversations, suggesting that pressure from within the department influenced his decision to speak now. They told jurors that gossip does not become truth simply because it is repeated under oath, but the damage had been done. Johnson's testimony put Robinson's credibility under direct assault. She had denied knowing Jones intimately before 2009. She had insisted her relationship with him was professional, framed by duty and neighborhood connections. Now a colleague claimed she had said otherwise long before investigators even suspected her of leaking information. The trial's momentum shifted. Prosecutors used the revelation to strengthen their closing arguments. They told jurors that Robinson's denials could no longer be trusted, that her timeline of contact with Jones had been crafted to minimize suspicion. They argued that the simplest explanation, the one supported by Johnson's memory, the wiretaps, and the suspicious calls, was that Robinson had been involved with Jones personally and had acted out of loyalty to him. For many in the courtroom, the gossip that had long swirled around Robinson finally found formal expression. Whispers about her closeness to Jones had circulated within the department and the community for years, but they had always remained unofficial. Johnson's testimony turned that gossip into evidence. By entering the record, it allowed prosecutors to connect rumor with motive, a move that resonated powerfully with the jury. The defense feared exactly that outcome. Their motion for mistrial failed, and their attempts to frame the testimony as unreliable gained little traction once the judge allowed it. With jurors hearing the words directly, the defense faced the reality that Robinson's credibility had cracked at the very moment it mattered most. As the trial wound toward conclusion, the bombshell revelation loomed over every argument. Prosecutors returned to it often, weaving it into their broader theme of betrayal. Defense attorneys tried to remind jurors of the late timing and questionable memory, but they were forced into a defensive posture. The once strong claim that Robinson's connections to Jones were misunderstood now sounded fragile. The collapse of her credibility was not just about timelines, but about motive. If she had been romantically tied to Jones, then her willingness to share information made emotional sense. Prosecutors framed it as loyalty born of intimacy, a classic story of an officer falling for someone on the wrong side of the law. For jurors, that story was easier to grasp than complex arguments about investigative procedure or community policing philosophy. By the time closing statements approached, observers agreed that Johnson's testimony had become the fulcrum of the case. The trial had been about evidence and timelines, but the bombshell transformed it into a story about trust, love, and betrayal. The defense could challenge procedures and gossip, but they could not erase the image of a fellow detective recalling Robinson's own admission. In the end, the testimony was not just another piece of evidence. It was the moment the case pivoted from doubt toward certainty, the turning point where jurors began to see Robinson less as a misunderstood officer and more as someone whose personal loyalties had overridden her oath. The gossip that had followed her career had finally been weaponized in court, and once spoken, it could not be undone. On August 3, 2021, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. The decision came after days of testimony that painted Robinson as a once respected detective, undone by her own choices. Inside the courtroom, silence filled the air as the clerk read the decision. Some jurors avoided eye contact with Robinson, while others stared straight ahead, their expressions hard to read. The prosecution team exchanged restrained nods. For them, the years of wiretaps, transcripts, and insider testimony had finally delivered accountability. On the defense side, Robinson sat still, her face betraying little emotion, but her family members wept quietly in the gallery. Outside, reporters captured the divided reaction. Some community members argued she had been targeted unfairly, while others said justice had finally been served. Sentencing followed later that month, on August 25th. Despite the felony conviction, Robinson avoided prison. The court imposed probation and community service, a strikingly light sentence considering the stakes. The judge's words, however, carried weight. "This case saddens me," he said, noting the fall from trusted officer to convicted felon. Yet he also acknowledged that prison time might not serve the public interest in this particular case. Still, the felony designation remained. Unlike other defendants who sometimes secured a reduction, Robinson's conviction stood firm. She left court a free woman, but one carrying the permanent stain of a felony record. Her legal team immediately filed notice of appeal, arguing procedural flaws and evidentiary issues. The fight over her name was not finished, even if the trial was over. The appeal moved slowly through California's courts, but by 2023, the conviction was upheld. Judges found no reversible errors in the sting operation or the late-stage testimony that had upended her defense. Robinson's professional life, however, was already gone. She lived quietly, avoiding media. Her career in law enforcement permanently ended. As a felon, her opportunities shrank drastically, leaving her a shadow of the officer once touted as a rising community policing figure. Meanwhile, Marlon P. Nice Jones continued pushing his music, maintaining a presence on streaming platforms and social media, even as his reputation remained tied to gang associations. The LBPD, scarred by the case, introduced new policies on handling officer misconduct, emphasizing stronger training around boundaries with community members. Among Long Beach residents, opinions stayed divided. Some believed Robinson had been sacrificed as a scapegoat, a convenient symbol for deeper institutional failures. Others saw her as a clear betrayer, someone who chose loyalty to the streets over duty to the badge. The legacy of her case lingered less in legal precedent and more in the uneasy conversations it forced about trust, policing, and betrayal. The story of Detective Yvonne Robinson remains unresolved in memory. Was she a scapegoat or a betrayer? What endures is the fracture of trust, a reminder that once a badge is compromised, the community never looks at it the same way again.